Okay, so Tiara, thank you very much for being with us today here and for the brand new section of Donna Camiro International. And so you're here to tell your story, and we're very glad and honored that you do so. And so as I said, this is a brand new section for Donna Camiro. We just want to explore different perspectives of women all around the world. So let's start. And why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and then how you came up with the idea of SolidariTee, of course.
Of course. So my name is Tiara Sahar. So I was born to Iranian parents in London, which, as you may know, is a really cosmopolitan and very diverse city, essentially. So I grew up kind of aware of the struggles that my parents had been through to get to the UK. I obviously had heard the stories that they told me and essentially their journey. I knew that well, but I hadn't really a material conception of what that was. So when I finished school, as a Farsi speaker, and in 2015, 2016, seeing the refugee crisis at its apex, thought it was really important that I could use my skills, my background to help others. So being a Farsi speaker, I knew that obviously I could communicate with Afghans, and seeing the size of the Kelly jungle, which was essentially an informal camp on the border between British and France, I essentially felt pretty much drawn to this as a kind of moral duty, a spiritual duty, a duty relating to my heritage. So I went, I tried my best. I was very young. I initially went thinking I could just be a spare pair of hands, help out in any warehouses that were around. And gradually in these trips I started making and started going to Greece, I began to realize that as a Farsi speaker, as someone who knew the culture a bit, my language skills were pretty rare. I was pretty appalled, I guess, to see that something so important, such as language skills, like the ability to interpret, to help asylum seekers get their message across clearly and concisely, that didn't exist. And I would frequently say to lawyers, look, I'm a native speaker, but I'm not a trained interpreter. I don't have legal training. Are you sure you want me to be doing this? And people would say frequently, look, it's you or Google Translate. And if you've ever used Google Translate, it is not the most accurate, especially not for Farsi. So the more I got involved in this, the more I realized there was this massive gap, essentially. And what people thought of when they thought of refugees or asylum seekers in Europe was the lack of clothing, the lack of food, the lack of accommodation, the lack of shelter. And the more I got involved, the more I saw that actually those were small surface permeations of the issue. The real issue was that people lived outside of the state. They lived outside of the realms of citizenship and legal status, and this was through no fault of their own. And the paths that are afforded to them for safety and security, namely asylum and then ultimately residency and ultimately citizenship, was so difficult to access because there weren't interpreters. Where there were interpreters, there weren't lawyers. Where there were lawyers, there weren't interpreters. And eventually it got to a point for me where I was very disillusioned. So I came back to Cambridge, where I was studying at the time. At this point, I was about 20. I admit I did not know a lot. I just knew that something was wrong. And I thought, well, what could I do? I knew that there were two things I wanted to change. One was that asylum seekers needed to have better access to legal aid and interpretation. The other was that I wanted people to understand the situation a bit better. So this is where I began to think, and I thought, look, I want to engage students, because I felt that students could make a big change. Students can easily change their opinions. They're open to new ideas. They're socially conscious. They don't have the kind of back-breaking responsibilities which many others do. For example, parents with children or individuals with dependents later in life, people who have a mortgage. I thought, you know what, this is a really good audience for this message. We can make change. At the same time, I didn't want to do something voluntaristic, so I didn't want to send out students who didn't have the right training to offer services to vulnerable peoples. I mean, if you think about if you have any legal issue in your life, you want to go to the best possible lawyer and get accurate advice. You would not accept advice from a student. It would be immoral. So I wanted to really make sure that students were involved, that students were at the front of this movement without necessarily being the ones who were offering the aid. And I also wanted to encourage students to have tricky conversations and to break out of their bubbles a bit. So eventually I came onto the idea of a t-shirt, which would be a t-shirt that people would wear, which have some sort of pro-refugee slogan or design, and it would create a kind of wave of support. So people would see each other wearing it and begin to normalize pro-refugee support. Or maybe someone wouldn't know what the shirt was about. They'd be intrigued, they'd ask, and that conversation begins to start. Maybe someone gets gifted what we now call a SolidariTee with a TEE for Christmas, and that's a way they hear about the movement. But at the same time, each of those shirts is raising money for legal aid for refugees. So for each £12 shirt you buy, which are vegan, organic, and all of the inks are non-damaging to the environment, all those £12 shirts, £7.50 goes directly to legal aid for refugees. So I thought this is probably the best way to go. And in my first year, I cannot say it was as organized as this, or the thoughts were as formulated in my head. That's definitely not the case. I ordered 600 shirts from my student loan, basically bankrupted myself, and that really gave me an impetus to sell. And so I was cycling around Cambridge trying to get people to buy them, and I had expected I'd sell maybe 100, and then over the summer I'd work on the rest. But within a month, 600 had gone. And it had been manic. There were many midnight bicycle trips across town to give people shirts and put them in pigeonholes, and yeah, a very busy time. But that's when I basically realized that this is not just a good project that made some impact, that actually I can get other students on board, and other students react well to this. This is a message that chimes with them. And so in the second year, my second year at university, I recruited 11 universities. In my third year, I recruited 36. Well, by this time, it wasn't me. It was an amazing team I had, actually, which to this day is about 90% women, which is great to see. And now in my final year university, it was around 42. And now we are at around 50, I think. And I've got to say, so I ran SolidariTee during my 4 years at university. But once I graduated, I essentially decided SolidariTee's power is that women predominantly and students are at the helm of change, and they can prove the world that they can be the change they want to see. That it's not about waiting for politicians who may or may not agree with our moral imperatives because they have political interests. We don't have to wait for them. We can prove that our model works. So I realized that, having led it for 4 years and now being a graduate, that at this point, it's not really for me to lead it anymore. It's for, if students want to be at the helm of this movement, they have to be at the helm of this movement from the very bottom to the very top. So now I'm just the chair of the board of trustees. What that means is I do the accounts, I oversee, I make sure we're in line with our regulatory framework, but all of the energy, all of the vision is coming from the team at the moment. So it's amazing to see.
Thank you for sharing such an amazing experience. And if I may, it's been like the best thing I've ever engaged with in my whole life since I've started with SolidariTee. I've been just amazed by all the energy of all the people and that you yourself put in this whole project.
No, it's down to people like you, for sure. I remember your photo shoot actually from 2 years ago. I think you were in the photo shoot, right?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, it's a great photo shoot.
Yeah, it's been a really a very interesting and new experience for me from the photo shoot to till now. It's been great, and SolidariTee is really a big family and a great project as well. So yeah, wow. So during this whole project of personal and also professional development and growth, I was wondering, did you look up to someone specific, and in particular, are there women that have inspired you and your growth on a personal and professional level, of course?
I often get asked this question, and I find it really hard to respond to, partly because I find the question itself a little difficult to conceptualize for me, because I meet so many people, especially women, who inspire me on what seem like the smallest things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I was really inspired by a lot of the women volunteers in SolidariTee, because I think women have this amazing ability to do things entirely for other people in the most selfless way. And I thought what was incredible was watching volunteers from across the country and now across the world do something that is really not against their self-interest, but has nothing really to do with their self-interest. All of our volunteers are unpaid. I still buy my own shirts. So there's no freebie, there is no financial interest in any way. Similar to that, I really hope that people learn from their experience at SolidariTee, find new friends, find a community, feel empowered. But at the same time, I think when you're working long hours and people can be a bit rude when you try to tell them about the refugee crisis, I don't think that if people were in it for self-interest, they'd stick around. So what's really inspired me is seeing women, I mean, as I say, it is predominantly women across the country and men striving for something that has so little to do with them. And it's in these small gestures that I often feel very inspired. Like, for example, seeing a representative really go out of their way to go and speak about solidarity at a lecture or at an event, and not even publicizing it, just doing it because they believe in the message and the cause. And I think these small acts of kindness are so important, especially in this climate, because it is so easy to become disheartened. And especially when you talk about something like the refugee crisis, especially in the last 4 years, where we see, for example, the situation in some of what we thought were the leaders of the free world, like the United States or the UK, that their responses to the refugee crisis have been so just heartbreaking. This is the state of humanity. What saves me from that hopelessness and despair are these tiny acts of kindness that actually mean the world, because no one person will ever create long-lasting change or impact. What will are tiny little acts of kindness, and I often think of them as a tapestry. Sometimes you have a really big contribution, but a tapestry is not just really big squares. A tapestry is small squares and small pieces of thread that weave everything together. And essentially, that's what I think SolidariTee is really harnessed. People who really want to do good don't know how. And when you bring all those people in the tapestry together, they're much stronger together.
Wow, this is really beautiful. I totally agree. It's really the like most spontaneous thing you could see, the engagement and the passion that people, and as you said, especially women in the case of SolidariTee, put in their effort. Amazing. And so what do you think are the challenges that women have to face nowadays when they try to create and promote their own product, just as you did? And of course, if you have any advice.
I find it so interesting about this, because whenever I meet up with women from SolidariTee or have an opportunity to go to one of their events, or even just listen to the way that they post on social media, the blogs they write, the interviews they give, they are so full of excellent ideas. And I think there is a quality about women which is societally constructed, I assume, because we're raised to be maternal and we're raised to be givers and carers. And I'm not going to get into gender politics and whether that should be the case, but I think it's a wonderful strength that women have, certainly as a result of our societal upbringing. And what I find is that women have so much insight and so much thought for others, but what holds them back is lack of self-belief. And I think lack of self-belief, it used to be a more crippling kind for women. If I think of my mother's generation, people actually said, you cannot do that, you should not do that. Now, I think the lack of self-belief I'm seeing amongst my sort of circles of university students who are passionate about making change is that they don't think that they are the best placed person, they're the most qualified person. But I can say from experience, I had no idea what I was doing at the beginning. I mean, I cannot emphasize how little I knew. And I think what really helped me, and probably is quite a female trait, is that I felt that I had really something to learn from anyone. Be it, I don't know, my dad's second cousin who works in a bank and could give me a tip about accounting, or be it a 12-year-old who uses social media and can give me their unique perspective on what catches their eye. Everyone has something to teach you, and women are excellent to that. So I think almost what women could take is that tiny bit of craziness to think, you know what, I can do it. Even if the rationality is saying absolutely not, you don't have the right qualifications. I think that tiny bit of craziness saying, you know what, you can, I believe in myself, that is worth years of experience to some extent. And this is something I'd really love to see from our SolidariTee volunteers, to see their kind of offshoot projects, because often people don't stop with being a rep. They start to think about maybe they're going to do something about gender equality, or maybe they're going to get involved and volunteer on the field. Maybe they're going to be interested in journalism about migration. And seeing these little offshoots is so inspiring, because I think that's what SolidariTee is very good at. It's saying to students, and often minorities who don't get put into leadership positions, hey, you know what, you can do it. You are doing it. And the idea that we've got a registered charity entirely run by students from top to bottom is kind of crazy, but it worked. So I think just harnessing a bit of that craziness would be a good thing.
That's great. That's a really important message, especially as you said, nowadays we have so many possibilities, and having people telling us that we should believe in ourselves and in our possibilities. It's just great to hear. Okay, so just to conclude, what is your dream in life right now at the moment?
You know, I go in, despite having spent the past 5 minutes saying that everyone should have the craziness to believe they can do it, I have my own crises of confidence, but something I would love to do is really think about how we respond to crisis. And what is crisis? I mean, we often talk about the refugee crisis. As I always say, I think it's a crisis of compassion. It's a crisis of mismanagement. We've had refugees crossing borders for millennia. We've had refugees crossing borders before borders even existed. And no one ever called it a crisis until we as the West were unable to manage it. We were unable to find the compassion. So what I would love is for there to be some sort of societal, I guess, society-wide collective effort about responding to crisis and how we define a crisis. I think often when we talk about the refugee crisis, it's a crisis for ourselves and not for the refugees, is what we really mean. So I would love to somehow be involved in rethinking what it means to help people in crisis, and what it even means to be in crisis at all. And if that means working in the humanitarian sector, or if that means writing, or if that means continuing to work in advocacy like with SolidariTee, I mean, that would be an honor and a privilege, really.
Thank you very much, Tiara, for sharing your experience and taking the time to talk to us. It's been really inspiring, and we wish all the best for you. Thank you very much
for having me.
Bye.
Bye then. Bye.